In this video, we're going to talk more about gymnosperms. So you're going to get kind of an introduction here, and then some other videos will go into more details. As you may recall from a previous video, we said that the first seeded plants, the gymnosperms, were likely evolved about 400 million years ago. There was a fossil found of something called a seed fern, and that's what this picture is showing right here. And this is the oldest known fossil of a gymnosperm. Remember that not all organisms are able to be fossilized, so it is possible that different plant structures maybe showed up before this, but this is the best evidence we have as to when gymnosperms showed up in the evolutionary timeline. Now, gymnosperms showed up when the environment on Earth started to become drier. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the adaptations of gymnosperms that made them better able to survive in these drier environments. About 240 million years ago, the diversity of gymnosperms really exploded. And so there was likely this kind of time on Earth where they just had the evolutionary advantage, and all these different types of gymnosperms were able to develop and evolve. One adaptation to living in a drier environment that allowed the gymnosperms to evolve had to do with the development of seeds. And so seeds, their main function is energy storage. So they help to protect and nourish the embryo. And the embryo is just a developing plant. Seeds have a protective coat that helps to prevent desiccation. And desiccation is the same thing as saying dehydration or drying out. Some of the seed coats are also really, really tough to prevent against abrasion. And abrasion would be like mechanical damage. So a tough seed coat would protect the developing embryo inside with this kind of these tough molecules that form this coat. Now, some seeds can have a really long dormancy, and what dormancy means is that the seed can exist and be out in the environment, but it's not necessarily germinating, meaning it's not growing into a plant yet. And this is another evolutionary advantage because germination can wait until the environmental conditions become perfect or just right for that plant. And dormancy can last potentially tens to thousands of years. Now, seedless plants don't have this protection, so they have to germinate right away, whether the environment is favorable for them to do so or not. The development of seeds also helps to increase gene dispersal through space and time. So by space, we mean over a wider geographic area. Because seeds might be picked up in one location and carried a long distance before they are then left to germinate in an environment that's favorable. With time, we're talking about those long dormancy times. So seeds can actually stay dormant, like we said, for potentially tens or thousands of years. And so genes that were combined 1,000 years ago might now be able to develop into a plant that has a genetic makeup that makes it favorable to today's environment. Another adaptation that allowed plants to survive in these drier environments is the production of pollen. And pollen is the male gametophyte, which contains haploid or one-end sperm. And sperm are the gametes, so these are basically the male sex cells. Pollen has a protective coat around the gametes that, once again, protects the sperm from desiccation, which would be drying out, and mechanical damage, which we can also call abrasion. So pollen, once again, can travel further away from the main plant. And when I say further, I mean further than seedless plants. And once again, this increases the range that those genes can spread because remember, the gametes are including some chromosomes from the parent plant. Some more general information about gymnosperms includes that they are the dominant plant type in coniferous biomes, or the taiga. And they can also be at high altitudes, which I did not put here. But they are typically found in cold, dry environments, and that's because they have these adaptations that allow them to survive in these areas. So a lot of gymnosperms are evergreens, which means that even in the wintertime, they can conduct some photosynthesis, even if it's a reduced amount from the summer because there just isn't as much sun in the winter. And then when spring rolls around, because the evergreens have kept their leaves or their needles throughout the entire year, they are ready for photosynthesis to ramp up in the spring when there's more sunlight. Now, deciduous trees are ones that lose their leaves in the fall and then regrow them in the spring. And so deciduous trees have the kind of the drawback in that they are not able to conduct photosynthesis when their leaves are gone, and they have to grow new leaves before they can start up photosynthesis again. Most of the pollination that happens in gymnosperms happens either by wind or insects. And these are vascular plants, so they have xylem and phloem. The word gymnosperm means naked seed. And so these are seeds that are not enclosed in an ovary. The seeds are still protected by modified leaves called sporophylls. And these sporophylls can essentially form these kind of tightened arrangements around the central stalk called a strobylus. And plural would be strobili. And this is just a fancy word for referring to pine cones. And so these are the strobili over here. And they enclose the seeds. So the seeds are found inside these cones. As we mentioned on the previous slide, gymnosperms have cones, and these cones are also called strobili. Now, there are separate male and female cones, and so the female cone is larger, and it is called an ovulate cone. And the male cone is smaller, and it is called a pollen cone. A plant might be monoecious, and mono means one. And what this means is that both the male and female cones are going to be on the same plant. So we still have two different cones. So we still have male versus female cones, but they're on the same plant. So that's where the mono comes from. So one plant has both male and female cones on it. Some plants are dioecious, which means that the male and female cones are on separate plants. And di, that prefix means two. So it just means that we are going to have plants that only have male cones and plants that only have female cones. The life cycle of the gymnosperms follows the alternation of generations, which we talked about when we talked about the seedless plants. And we will go into more detail about the life cycle of conifers in a different video. The sporophyte generation is the more dominant generation. So if we look at this pine tree here, this is the sporophyte. So this is what we see. It's much more noticeable. It's conspicuous. And the cells in this tree are multicellular, or I'm sorry, the tree itself is multicellular, and the cells are all diploid, which means that they have the two sets of chromosomes. the gametophytes, first of all, there are male and female separate gametophytes, and they are multicellular but haploid. So remember that meiosis has to occur in order to form the cells that form these gametophytes. And in this case here, these cones, or these strabili, are the gametophytes. And you're probably familiar with pine trees, and you know that the cones are really dependent on the sporophytes. Now, the cones will fall off the tree, but the living cones rely on the tree. If we look at the classification of gymnosperms, first of all, the domain, and remember the domain is the most inclusive or kind of the broadest level of classification. And so gymnosperms are in domain Eukarya. Remember that the other domains that you have learned about already this semester include domain Bacteria and domain Archaea. They are in the supergroup Archaeplastida. Remember that Archaeplastida includes plants and also some red and green algae. The kingdom is Plantae, and I actually misspelled it here, so I'll put an E on there. So Plantae is the kingdom. And then there are 4 phyla that represent the gymnosperms. There's the Coniferophyta, which are the conifers, Cycadophyta, which are the cycads, Ginkgophyta, which are the ginkgophytes, and Cnidophyta, which are the cnidophytes. And in a different video, we'll talk a little bit more about these different phyla of gymnosperms.